Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about China and Africa and Chinese philanthropic outreach to Africa. About 4 years ago, when people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett went to China to try to encourage a philanthropic sector, they came back very depressed because A, there wasn't a philanthropic sector, and B, among the newly emerging oligarchic class, there was no great desire to become a philanthropic power in the known universe. This is starting to change. Those of you who live in capital cities where there are Primark stores will understand that Chinese outreach on an incredible mercantile basis has now reached just about every single sector of European chattering classes, but also online. Alibaba, the website, is pretty much like the Primark of the electronic era. It makes Amazon look like a very, very primitive consortium of overpriced goods. The founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, has just floated his company, Alibaba, on the international stock exchanges, starting off in America. This is meant to be a huge event to rival what happened when Facebook was floated. And one of the things that Jack Ma announced was that he was going to begin a huge philanthropic fund. Now, there are some very interesting aspects of this. The first is it's the first major fund to be started by an oligarchic figure from China. He's one of the richest people in China. Secondly, he's not putting in any of his own money. He's putting in, as it were, money derived from stock options. Thirdly, there seems to be no real program behind this philanthropic outreach. It seems very, very much to make the stock offer palatable to an American investing public. An American investing public that's gotten used to the idea of corporate responsibility, corporate outreach, and some sense of corporate involvement in the world beyond simply making profit. So very, very much to recast the image of Alibaba, not simply as a mercantile electronic giant, but very, very much in the line of responsible corporations. And as a side benefit, Jack Ma gets to benefit from being called the first of a new generation of Chinese oligarchs. As I say, there seems to be no real plan. When he starts talking about it, he talks about green fields, blue skies, and of course anyone who comes from China will know that blue skies are not always in abundance, particularly around Beijing. And the idea of environmental cleanliness, some kind of environmental hygiene, is probably going to be top of the list. Whether this goes beyond merely China and Chinese citizens and the way that they live, whether it reaches out to other parts of the world like Africa, is the big question. And I don't think it's going to have very much outreach, and if it does, it is going to be very, very much confined to certain key sectors, which I'll describe to you in a minute. But just a word first about the Chinese outreach in Africa. There's a lot of fuss right now, particularly in American foreign policy circles, about the new Chinese grab for Africa. This is a fear born entirely out of ignorance. The Chinese have been around in Africa since independence and the years before independence, meaning from the 1960s onwards. They were involved in a huge number of civil engineering, construction projects, very much involved in a whole number of liberation efforts. So as late as 1980, when I was a very, very young peacekeeper, and very, very expendable by virtue of being not only young, but extremely foolhardy and reckless, perfectly expendable, nothing has changed in that sense, and working in what was then Rhodesia, just about to become Zimbabwe, a fraught 3-month period, which involved a very great deal of keeping armies, as it were, placated, came across Zimbabwean colonels fighting for Robert Mugabe's forces. They saw that I was Chinese. They pulled out chopsticks and said, we would like to eat with you in the same way that our Chinese advisors and trainers had taught us how to eat with these chopsticks. Can you talk Mandarin, by the way, because we can. So I can't. I talk Cantonese. So this was a very salutary lesson. By that time, the Chinese had probably spent something like 100 million US per African country up to that point in 1980, which was a huge amount of money when you look at what costs were, when you look at the value of money throughout the 60s and 70s up to 1980. What you've got now in terms of the Chinese outreach to Africa is simply a recasting of something that's always been there, but obviously along capitalist lines, recognizably capitalist lines of resource appropriation, investment so that there are very, very good reservoirs of goodwill to be in a prime position to acquire more resources in the future. One of the reasons why the West is very upset about this is not that we need African oil now, but we will in 20 years' time, when Middle Eastern oil perhaps is no longer quite as easily available and fracking has undermined all of our underground reservoirs and structures. So that is exactly the futures, the mineral and the resource futures the Chinese are buying now. In order to buy it, to buy upstream resources now, a huge amount of official aid goes into African countries on a scale which the West simply can't match. And Chinese corporations having a very, very strong either governmental or party control ethos, that is, there's a very great deal of party and all government direct investment in these corporations, if not actually controlling interests on the boards of these corporations. It means that the corporations can move at a speed faster than ours can in terms of securing official Chinese support for any kinds of aid deals that they wish to broker with the host government. So the scale of Chinese investment and philanthropy is huge. Now, this corporate or government or party philanthropy is simply not matched in any sense by private philanthropy. As I said, when Bill Gates and Warren Buffett went over to China just 4 years ago, they found a complete absence of this kind of mega corporate and personal philanthropy of the sort that Gates and Buffett epitomize. And don't forget, it's really something quite new to us as well. And they come at very, very much the end of a very long 100-year sort of cycle of people becoming philanthropists when at one point in time they were not perhaps, let us say, the most uncorrupt people on earth. When you look at the robber barons, the cattle barons, the rail barons of the United States 100, 150 years ago, all of whom have very, very dignified names now, all of whom have foundations named after them, all of whom are munificent in their support for foundations. Let us say those names were not associated with good causes 100 and 150 years ago. I won't name them, you know them, but there are laws of libel in this country, of course. The Chinese may be going through a very, very similar phase, but I think there are two other constraining factors which I want to describe to you. The first is very, very much, it comes out of a legacy of a communist sense of ideology and philosophic commitment, which of course has been the governing factor in the way that China has developed up to this slightly more economically liberal point in time. And this is very much an ethos where the state does everything. So the state is what is involved in terms of expansion, aid and philanthropy in Africa today. The second is that although there's a very strong Confucian element still in China, this Confucian element is very, very much tied in terms of hierarchical relationships which are intimate. So I have a hierarchical obligation to my wife and children, for instance. My wife wouldn't like that description, of course. But in Confucian traditionalism, my responsibilities are linear, up, down, very, very much to those around me. So my responsibilities to those far away is going to be far more diffuse, far more abstract than my, as it were, obligations to those who are directly connected to me in this kind of vertical relationship. And Africa is far away. Added to that a third factor, and that is despite a huge munificence in terms of Chinese aid, what you still have in China is a very, very, what I would say is an arcane view of Africa, indeed of much of the outside world, but particularly when it comes to Africa and many other developing countries, which in many respects I would regard as frankly racist. And this is aided and abetted, not knowingly but unwittingly, by a research apparatus, not only in the universities but in the party's research departments, which I do not count as research at all, because in order to maintain tenure, in order to get promotion, you've got to keep towing the party line. So you have a virtuous, or rather a vexatious circle, where the same kind of lack of research and depth, the lack of critical research and depth, keeps being recycled because there's no other way for these people to maintain status and to keep making a living, let alone rising up the path of becoming a professor of this or professor of that.
So that when I was involved more recently, about 10 years ago, in China-Africa trade talks as an advisor to African delegations, and we were looking at the research being served to the Politburo in China on African issues, then my reaction was that this was extraordinarily primitive research indeed. With all of these feeds going into the Chinese machine and a lack of readiness to branch out of the state capsule which provides philanthropy, I don't think that Jack Ma, for instance, as the first of a so-called new breed, is going to reach out to Africa on any great scale, except in certain key factors. And this is where I think the theme of the conference today becomes quite important. Blue skies, hygienic environment, and hygienic environment as it affects people and their exposure to disease. This is something that's easy to explain. It's something which can escape the bounds of racist outlooks. It becomes a simple humanitarian ethos, a simple humanitarian outreach. However, having said that, when you have a lack of research at the highest levels in terms of what Africa is all about, state level, party level, and my early comment that Jack Ma doesn't seem to have put into place or have contemplated how to put into place any kind of research and strategic apparatus. When you look at the Gates Foundation, for instance, and the huge apparatus that exists there in terms of researching projects and in terms of assessing strategic investment in programs, huge, as it were, brains trust that goes into that. The first Chinese oligarch turned philanthropist has none of that. So this is going to be a long learning curve. If you're looking for an immediate impact of Chinese philanthropy in Africa, particularly in the field of infectious diseases, well, maybe it will come, but I wouldn't hold my breath for it to come anytime in the next 2 or 3 years. Thank you.